The hot Wyoming sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Thornwood, a frontier town nestled between rolling grasslands and the distant, hazy silhouette of the Bighorn Mountains. Judge Walter Harrington's gavel came down with finality, the sharp crack echoing through the makeshift courthouse. "The court has made its decision," he announced, wiping sweat from his brow with a handkerchief that had long since lost its pristine whiteness. "Miss Eleanor Blackwood, in absence of any living relatives, the marriage shall take place within the month, at which time Mr. Pierce will assume full responsibility for Miss Blackwood's inheritance and properties." Eleanor stood rigid, her knuckles white, as she gripped the wooden railing separating her from the rest of the courtroom. At 24, she was no child in need of guardianship, and the 40 acres of prime grazing land left to her by her father had made her a target since the day of his funeral 6 weeks prior. Her gaze drifted to Pierce, with his expensive Eastern suit and carefully trimmed mustache. Behind his practiced smile, she could see the calculating gleam in his eyes, not of a man who desired a wife, but one who coveted land. "Your Honor," she began, her voice stronger than she felt, "I must protest. I am fully capable of—" The gavel struck again, cutting her objection short. "Hey, friends, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel and let me know what city you're watching from in the comments below." "The matter is settled, Miss Blackwood," the judge said dismissively. "Women aren't equipped to manage such affairs alone in these territories. Mr. Pierce is doing you a great service." A murmur rippled through the crowded courtroom, a mixture of sympathy and morbid curiosity. Eleanor felt the walls closing in around her as Pierce approached, extending his arm, as if they were already husband and wife. With no legal recourse left, she reluctantly took it, her mind racing for an escape from this cage fashioned from law and convention. As they stepped outside into the blinding sunlight, Pierce's fingers dug painfully into her arm. "You should be grateful," he whispered, his pleasant facade slipping momentarily. "There are worse fates for a woman alone than becoming Mrs. Jonathan Pierce." Eleanor pulled away slightly, her blue eyes like ice as they met his. "My father's land will never be yours," she said, keeping her voice low but firm. Pierce's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "It already is, my dear. By this time next month, everything that was your father's will be mine by law. I suggest you become accustomed to the idea." A crowd had gathered outside the courthouse, townsfolk eager to witness the aftermath of a trial that had been the talk of Thornwood for days. Eleanor scanned their faces, some sympathetic, others judging, most simply curious about the spectacle. But one face caught her attention and held it, a man standing apart from the others, tall and stoic, with copper skin weathered by sun and time. The stranger's dark eyes met hers, unflinching and unreadable. He stood with the quiet confidence of a man who had weathered storms both literal and figurative. His clothes were a curious blend of Western and native attire. Fringed buckskin jacket over a cotton shirt, worn trousers tucked into moccasins rather than boots. But what truly marked him was the glimpse of scarred flesh visible at his collar, old wounds, deliberate in their patterning. Cherokee, Eleanor thought immediately, recognizing the distinctive features her father had taught her to respect during their years on the frontier. Something in his steady gaze seemed to cut through the performance playing out on the courthouse steps, seeing beyond Pierce's gentlemanly facade to the predator beneath. In that moment of silent exchange, Eleanor felt something she had not expected: recognition, not of faces, but of spirits similarly unbowed. Pierce followed her gaze and stiffened. "Come along, Eleanor," he said sharply, tugging her arm. "There's no need to associate with such elements." His voice carried deliberately, loud enough for those nearby to hear his disdain. The Cherokee man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger or offense, but a deep, patient knowing. As Pierce practically dragged her toward the waiting carriage, Eleanor found herself looking back over her shoulder, drawn by the inexplicable sense that she had just encountered someone significant to her fate. The man remained motionless, watching her go, his scarred chest rising and falling with steady breaths as the distance between them grew. Over the following days, Eleanor felt like a prisoner in her own home, the modest but comfortable ranch house her father had built with his own hands. Pierce had not moved in yet. Appearances had to be maintained until the wedding, but his presence lingered in the form of two hired men who loitered constantly on her property. Ostensibly for her protection, their true purpose was transparent. They were jailers, not guardians. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, watching as one of Pierce's men exercised his horse in what had once been her mother's garden. Her fingers traced the edge of her father's old Remington revolver, hidden in the folds of her apron. Jacob Blackwood had raised his daughter to shoot straight and think independently, qualities that had served her well until the law itself became the weapon used against her. "He underestimates you," came a deep voice from the shadows behind her. Eleanor whirled around, the Remington instantly in her hand, and aimed at the intruder's chest. The Cherokee man from the courthouse stood in her kitchen doorway, seemingly untroubled by the gun pointed at his heart. "You should not be here," Eleanor whispered urgently, glancing toward the windows. "Pierce's men are watching the front," he finished for her. "They guard against threats they understand. I am not one of those." Despite the danger, Eleanor found herself lowering the revolver slightly. There was something in his calm demeanor that didn't trigger the alarm bells her father had taught her to heed. "Who are you?" she asked. "And why are you in my kitchen?" "I am called Thomas Blackhorse," he replied, his voice carrying the slight cadence of someone who had grown up speaking a different tongue. "I knew your father." Eleanor's grip tightened on the revolver again. "My father never mentioned you." Thomas's expression remained impassive. "Jacob Blackwood saved my life during the war. Confederate soldiers had captured me while I was scouting for the Union. They had plans for me." His hand unconsciously moved to his chest, where Eleanor had glimpsed the scars. "Your father freed me before they finished their work. We made a pact then. Each would owe the other a life debt." His dark eyes met hers directly. "I have come to repay what I owe." Eleanor studied him cautiously, weighing his words against her instincts. "And I'm supposed to believe that a Cherokee man my father never mentioned has suddenly appeared to save me from an unwanted marriage." Thomas reached slowly into his pocket, giving her ample time to raise her weapon if she chose. Instead of a threat, he produced a worn, folded letter. "Your father wrote to me 3 months ago, before his heart failed him. He sensed his time was coming and feared for you. He knew men like Pierce would circle like vultures once he was gone." Eleanor hesitantly took the letter, recognizing her father's handwriting immediately. The dates aligned with when her father had begun complaining of chest pains. The signature at the bottom, complete with the small flourish he always added to the final wood, was unmistakable. "This still doesn't explain how you plan to help me," Eleanor said, refolding the letter carefully. "The law has spoken. In 3 weeks, I'll be Mrs. Jonathan Pierce, and everything my father built will belong to a man who sees me as nothing more than an inconvenient addition to the property he covets." Thomas moved further into the kitchen, his movements deliberate and quiet. The white man's law is like a river. It appears fixed in its course, but there are ways to divert it if you understand how it flows. He settled into a chair at the kitchen table, as if they were old acquaintances having a casual discussion. Tell me, Miss Blackwood, how far are you willing to go to keep your freedom? Eleanor considered the question seriously, turning the revolver in her hands before placing it on the table between them. Not threatening, but present. I've considered running, she admitted, but Pierce has connections throughout the territory. And even if I escaped, I would be leaving behind everything my parents worked for. This land was my mother's dream before consumption took her. My father poured his life into making it thrive. I won't abandon it. A faint smile touched Thomas's lips, the first real expression she had seen from him. Good. Running solves nothing, but there is another way to use the white man's laws against men like Pierce. Your father and I spoke of this possibility. What do you mean? Eleanor asked, leaning forward despite herself. Thomas's dark eyes held a calculating intelligence that reminded her suddenly of her father. The judge promised you to Pierce, because a woman alone cannot hold property in these territories without challenge. But a married woman's property becomes her husband's. Understanding dawned slowly on Eleanor's face, followed quickly by disbelief. You're suggesting I marry someone else before Pierce can claim me? Thomas nodded once, the movement barely perceptible. I am suggesting an arrangement of mutual benefit, a marriage in name only, but one that would secure your land against Pierce's ambitions. Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen. That's absurd. The judge has already decreed. The judge decreed a marriage within the month, Thomas interrupted quietly. He did not specify to whom. Eleanor stopped, staring at him. You're talking about marriage to you? A Cherokee? The judge would never allow it. Thomas raised an eyebrow slightly. Wyoming Territory recognizes marriages between whites and Indians. Judge Harrington cannot legally prevent such a union if properly executed. He may not approve, but his approval is not required by law. Eleanor's mind raced through the implications. Even as that were true, Pierce would contest it immediately. Let him, Thomas said with a calm certainty that gave Eleanor pause. Pierce relies on manipulation and intimidation. When faced with actual legal challenges, men like him often reveal their weakness. He leaned forward, his scarred hands clasped before him. I offer you protection through a temporary arrangement. Once Pierce has moved on to easier targets, we can dissolve the union, and I will return to my own people. You will retain your land and your independence. Eleanor studied him skeptically. And what do you gain from this arrangement, Mr. Blackhorse? I find it hard to believe you've traveled all this way simply to repay an old debt. Thomas was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Your father was the only white man who ever treated me as an equal, he finally said. When others saw a savage, he saw a soldier and a man. The debt I owe is real. He paused, then added, but you are right. There is more. The railroad is coming through these territories. They have been forcing Cherokee and other tribes from their lands further east. I need to understand how the white man's laws regarding land can be used to protect my people's interests. What better way to learn than to navigate them myself? Eleanor nodded slowly, beginning to understand. So this would benefit us both. I keep my land, and you gain knowledge to help your tribe. A fair exchange, Thomas confirmed. but we must act quickly. Pierce is not a patient man, and your wedding date approaches." Eleanor felt herself at a crossroads, weighing an impossible choice. Marriage to a stranger, a Cherokee no less, against forced union with a man she despised. "I need to think," she said finally. Thomas rose from the chair with fluid grace. "You have until tomorrow night. I'll return then for your answer." He moved toward the back door, then paused. "Pierce's men are watching the house, but not closely enough. Their confidence makes them careless." With that observation hanging in the air, he slipped out as silently as he had entered, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and her father's letter clutched tightly in her hand. Night fell over the Wyoming Territory, bringing with it a chorus of coyotes and the distant hooting of owls. Eleanor sat alone by lamplight, reading her father's letter for the 10th time, searching for guidance between the lines of this familiar handwriting. Jacob Blackwood had always been a man of foresight, and his final letter confirmed what she had already suspected. He had known Pierce would make a move for their land after his death. What surprised her was his explicit trust in Thomas Blackhorse, a man he had apparently kept secret from her all these years. "He is a man of honor in a world with precious little of it," her father had written. "Trust him as I have, daughter, should trouble find you." A sharp knock at the front door pulled Eleanor from her contemplation. Setting aside the letter, she took up her father's revolver and moved cautiously through the darkened house. "Who's there?" she called, standing to the side of the door rather than directly in front of it, as her father had taught her. "It's Jonathan Pierce, Eleanor. Open the door, please." Her heart sank at the sound of his voice. It was well past the hour for social calls, and the slight slur in his words suggested he'd been drinking. She considered ignoring him altogether, but knew that would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Keeping the revolver hidden in the folds of her skirt, she opened the door a few inches, the chain still latched. Pierce's usually immaculate appearance had suffered. His collar was open, his hair mussed, and the smell of whiskey hung about him like a cloud. "My dear fiancé," he said with exaggerated formality, "aren't you going to invite me in?" Eleanor stood her ground. "It's late, Mr. Pierce. Whatever business you have can wait until morning." Pierce's pleasant expression slipped, revealing the ugliness beneath. "I've heard troubling rumors," he said, his voice hardening, "about a savage seen leaving your property today. I find myself concerned for your virtue." The implication in his tone made Eleanor's skin crawl. "My virtue is none of your concern until after our wedding," she replied coldly. "And I've had no visitors today except your own men, who seem more interested in preventing me from leaving than stopping anyone from entering." Pierce pushed against the door, testing the strength of the chain. "Don't play games with me, Eleanor. I've worked too hard to secure this arrangement." His voice dropped to a threatening whisper. "If you think you can escape our agreement by compromising yourself with some half-breed, you're sorely mistaken. No judge would recognize such a union, and you'd find yourself with nothing. No land, no reputation, no future." Eleanor felt a chill at the calculation behind his drunken facade. Pierce wasn't just angry. He was afraid of losing his prize. "I suggest you go home and sober up, Mr. Pierce," she said firmly. "This conversation is over." As she began to close the door, Pierce slammed his shoulder against it, the chain straining ominously. "You listen to me," he hissed. "That land will be mine, one way or another. If you force my hand, I promise you won't like the outcome." The sharp click of a gun being cocked came from behind Pierce, freezing him in place. "Step away from the lady's door," came a calm, steady voice that Eleanor immediately recognized. Thomas Blackhorse materialized from the shadows of the porch, a Colt revolver trained on Pierce's back. "This doesn't concern you, Indian," Pierce spat without turning around. Thomas moved closer, the moonlight revealing his imposing figure. "Miss Blackwood asked you to leave. I suggest you heed her request." Pierce slowly turned, his eyes widening slightly as he took in Thomas's appearance. The Cherokee stood tall in the moonlight, his scarred chest partially visible where his shirt lay open at the collar. Despite his inebriated state, Pierce was sober enough to recognize the danger in the steady hand holding the Colt. "You're making a grave mistake," he said, straightening his vest in an attempt to regain his dignity. "Threatening a respected businessman could see you hanged." Thomas's expression remained impassive. "I've made no threats. I'm simply ensuring Miss Blackwood's safety on her own property." His dark eyes flicked briefly to Eleanor. "Would you like me to escort Mr. Pierce back to town?" Eleanor saw her opportunity and seized it. "That won't be necessary, Thomas. Mr. Pierce was just leaving of his own accord. Weren't you, Mr. Pierce?" She infused her voice with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Pierce's gaze darted between them, his mind visibly working through these limited options. With a final venomous glare, he stepped back from the door. "This isn't over," he promised quietly, before turning on his heel and walking unsteadily toward the waiting horse tethered to her fence post. Thomas kept his weapon trained on Pierce until the man had mounted and ridden away, his back rigid with humiliation and rage. Once Pierce was out of sight, Eleanor released the chain and opened the door fully. "You're early," she said simply. Thomas holstered his weapon with practiced ease. "I thought it prudent to watch the house tonight." Pierce struck me as a man unaccustomed to obstacles. He glanced in the direction the businessman had disappeared. "He will be more dangerous now." Eleanor sighed, suddenly feeling the weight of her situation. "Come inside," she said after a moment's hesitation. "I believe we have an arrangement to discuss." Thomas followed her into the house, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe. In the lamplight of her father's home, surrounded by the familiar trappings of her life, Eleanor faced the stranger who offered her only chance at freedom. "I've made my decision," she said, placing her father's letter on the table between them. "I accept your proposal, Mr. Blackhorse, but I have conditions of my own." Thomas inclined his head slightly, waiting. "This will be a marriage in name only," Eleanor continued firmly. "You will have no claim to my land or property beyond what is necessary to prevent Pierce from seizing it. Once the danger has passed, we will seek an annulment or divorce, whichever can be accomplished most quietly." Thomas nodded once. "Agreed." Eleanor took a deep breath before continuing. "And you must teach me everything you learn about protecting land rights. If I'm to maintain my independence after our arrangement ends, I need to understand the laws that nearly trapped me." A glimmer of respect showed in Thomas's eyes. "Your father said you had his mind for strategy. I will teach you what I learn." He extended his hand across the table, offering it as he would to a business partner, rather than a prospective bride. "Do we have an agreement, Miss Blackwood?" Eleanor hesitated only briefly before clasping his hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused from work, not unlike her father's had been. "We do, Mr. Blackhorse, though I suspect neither of us fully understands what we're embarking upon." For the first time, she saw a genuine smile cross his face, transforming his stoic features. "Few ever do when they marry," he observed dryly, "but most have fewer complications than ours." The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of heat later in the day. Eleanor had slept little, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. Thomas had departed after their agreement, refusing her offer of the sofa and instead melting into the darkness beyond the house. She didn't know where he had spent the night, but when she stepped onto her porch at first light, she found him sitting on the bottom step, alert and watching the horizon as the sun began to paint the distant mountains gold and pink. Pierce's men left an hour ago, he informed her without turning around. Riding hard toward town. They'll be reporting your late-night visitor. Eleanor joined him on the step, keeping a proper distance between them. Then we don't have much time. Pierce will move quickly now. She had spent the hours of darkness considering their next steps. The nearest judge who might perform our ceremony is in Benson Creek, about 30 miles east. If we leave now, we could reach it by nightfall. Thomas nodded, his eyes still on the horizon. I have horses prepared, but there is something you should understand before we proceed. He finally turned to face her, his expression serious. Once we do this, there is no going back. Pierce is not a man who will accept defeat graciously. He will seek revenge, not just against me, but against you as well. Eleanor felt a chill despite the growing warmth of the morning. I'm aware of the risk, she said quietly, but I see no other option that allows me to keep what's rightfully mine. Thomas studied her for a long moment, as if measuring her resolve. Your father was right about you, he finally said. You have the heart of a warrior. He stood in one fluid motion. Pack only what you need for a few days. We'll return once the marriage is recorded and filed properly. Eleanor hesitated, suddenly faced with the reality of what they were about to do. Mr. Blackhorse, Thomas, thank you. I know this arrangement serves your purposes as well, but still, I am grateful. Thomas's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. Jacob Blackwood taught me that there is honor in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. In helping you, I honor both his memory and my people's traditions. He gestured toward the house. Go prepare. We must be on the trail before Pierce can organize men to stop us. Eleanor nodded and hurried inside, gathering only essential items, a change of clothes, her father's revolver and ammunition, the documents proving her ownership of the land, and a small portrait of her parents on their wedding day. As she packed these items into saddlebags, she caught her reflection in her mother's old mirror. I'm doing what I must, she whispered to herself. For the land, for father's legacy, this is merely a business arrangement. But as she turned away, she couldn't quite silence the voice that wondered what her parents would think of the path she had chosen. The journey to Benson Creek was tense and largely silent. They rode hard, taking little-used trails that Thomas seemed to know intimately, always alert for signs of pursuit. By midday, they had covered nearly half the distance, and Eleanor's muscles ached from the punishing pace. When they stopped briefly to rest the horses by a small stream, she finally voiced the question that had been nagging at her. Those scars on your chest, may I ask how you got them? Thomas, who had been filling their canteens, paused momentarily. It is a long story, he said, his tone neutral, and not a pleasant one. Eleanor didn't press immediately, sensing his reluctance. After a moment, however, he continued unexpectedly. I was captured near Chattanooga in '63, he said, his voice matter-of-fact. The Confederate soldiers discovered I was Cherokee, scouting for the Union. They decided this made me a traitor to the South, where many of my people had been forced to resettle decades earlier. He handed Eleanor a filled canteen, his movements deliberate. They began what they called correction. Each cut was meant to be a lesson. He touched his chest lightly through his shirt. The pattern is unfinished. Your father interrupted their education on the third day. Eleanor felt sick at the clinical way he described such torture. "I'm sorry," she said inadequately. "The war brought out the worst in many men." Thomas's expression remained unreadable. "And the best in others. Your father had no reason to risk himself for an Indian scout. Many Union officers would have looked the other way." He secured the canteen to his saddle. Jacob Blackwood was a rare man. He saw people as people, regardless of the color of their skin. He checked the cinch on his horse's saddle. "We should continue. There's still much ground to cover." As they mounted up and resumed their journey, Eleanor found herself seeing Thomas in a new light, not just as a means to secure her property, but as a man who had suffered greatly and yet retained his dignity and sense of purpose. The arranged marriage they were rushing toward suddenly felt more significant than a mere legal maneuver. They reached Benson Creek as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the small frontier town. Unlike Thornwood, with its aspirations of gentility, Benson Creek was a raw, practical place, a way station for travelers heading further west, with a single dusty street lined by essential businesses, a general store, a stable, a boarding house, and a saloon that served as the center of the community's social life. "The judge has rooms above the general store," Thomas informed her, as they rode slowly down the main street, drawing curious glances from the few people still out and about. "His name is Morris. He's known for being fair-minded, even toward Indians and other outsiders." Eleanor adjusted her bonnet nervously. "And you think he'll agree to marry us, without asking too many questions?" Thomas's expression grew grim. "He will marry us. I saved his son's life during a Sioux raid 2 years ago, but whether he can do so without word reaching Pierce is another matter. Frontier towns have long memories and longer telegraph wires." He dismounted in front of the general store and helped Eleanor down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, a reminder that for all their talk of arrangements and legal strategies, they were a man and woman embarking on something intimate, regardless of their intentions. Judge Morris was a weathered man in his 60s, with kind eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be easily shocked. He listened to their story, or the version of it Thomas chose to tell, with thoughtful attention, occasionally glancing at Eleanor, as if to gauge her comfort with the situation. "So you're telling me you need to be married immediately, before this Pierce fellow can force the young lady into an unwanted union?" he clarified, pouring 3 fingers of whiskey into small glasses. "That's the essence of it," Thomas confirmed, accepting the offered drink but not consuming it. "Miss Blackwood's father was my friend and comrade. I promised to look after her should anything happen to him." The judge turned his penetrating gaze to Eleanor. "And this arrangement meets with your approval, young lady? You understand what you're agreeing to?" Eleanor straightened her spine, meeting his eyes directly. "I do, Your Honor. My father trusted Mr. Blackhorse with his life. I'm choosing to do the same." She paused, then added firmly, "And I would rather make this choice freely than have one forced upon me by men who see me only as a path to property." The judge studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. I've never been one to interfere with a woman's right to choose her own path, however unconventional." He set down his glass with finality. "I can perform the ceremony tonight and file the paperwork first thing tomorrow morning." As the judge moved to retrieve his Bible from a nearby shelf, he added casually, "I should mention that a telegram came through this afternoon from Thornwood, Seems a prominent businessman there is concerned about a Cherokee man who allegedly abducted a young woman from her home. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged alarmed glances. Pierce works quickly, Thomas observed grimly. The judge's expression remained neutral. Indeed, fortunately, I've received no description of this young woman, nor any official warrant for the Cherokee man's arrest, and I make it a policy not to involve myself in matters outside my jurisdiction unless formally requested to do so. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. Once the marriage is recorded, of course, any claims of abduction would be considerably more difficult to pursue. The ceremony itself was brief and utilitarian, performed in the judge's private quarters with only his housekeeper as witness. Eleanor wore the same travel-stained riding dress she had arrived in, while Thomas stood tall and solemn in his buckskin jacket. The words were familiar, promises of fidelity and support that generations of couples had exchanged. But the context rendered them strange and hollow. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, there was a moment of awkward silence. No kiss was exchanged, no celebration planned. Instead, Thomas simply took her hand briefly, his touch gentle but impersonal. "Thank you, Judge Morris," he said with quiet dignity. "We are in your debt." The judge closed his Bible with a snap. "The debt is mine, Black Horse, as you well know. John would have died in that raid if not for you." He turned to Eleanor with grandfatherly concern. "Mrs. Blackhorse," he said, using her new name for the first time, "I've arranged rooms for you both at the boarding house across the street. I suggest you rest tonight and depart early tomorrow. Once I file the marriage certificate, word will spread quickly." Eleanor nodded, suddenly exhausted by the emotions and tensions of the day. "Thank you, Your Honor. Your kindness won't be forgotten." As they left the judge's quarters and stepped into the night air, Eleanor felt the weight of her new reality settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was now, in the eyes of the law and society, Mrs. Thomas Blackhorse, wife to a Cherokee stranger with scars on his chest and mysteries in his past. The boarding house was modest but clean, with faded floral wallpaper and hand-sewn quilts on the beds. The elderly proprietor had raised an eyebrow at the unlikely couple, but asked no questions when Thomas requested 2 adjacent rooms. Now, alone in her small chamber, Eleanor sat on the edge of the narrow bed, turning her new gold band, hastily purchased from the general store before the ceremony, around her finger. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. "Yes," she called, automatically reaching for the revolver she kept close at hand. "It's Thomas," came the quiet reply. "May I speak with you briefly?" Eleanor tucked the weapon back into her saddlebag and moved to open the door, keeping it partially closed as propriety demanded. Thomas stood in the hallway, still fully dressed despite the late hour. "I've been thinking about our next steps," he said without preamble. "Pierce will have men watching your ranch. Returning directly would be dangerous." Eleanor nodded wearily. "I had the same thought. What do you propose?" Thomas's expression was thoughtful. "We should travel to Cheyenne first. The territorial land office there can record our marriage in connection with your property deed. Once that's done, Pierce will have no legal avenue to pursue." He paused, then added, "It would also be wise to hire legal representation while we're there, someone who can advise us on protecting your interests long-term." "Our interests," Eleanor corrected automatically. "This arrangement involves both of us now." Something flickered in Thomas's dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or appreciation. "Yes," he acknowledged, "our interests." An awkward silence fell between them, highlighting the strangeness of their situation. They were legally married, yet still largely strangers. Eleanor felt she should say something more, but exhaustion clouded her thoughts. "We should both rest," Thomas said finally, seemingly sensing her fatigue. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." He hesitated, then added, "Good night, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice affected her more than she cared to admit. "Good night, Thomas," she replied softly, closing the door as he turned to go. Alone again, she sank back onto the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. She had awoken that morning as Eleanor Blackwood, a woman fighting to maintain her independence. She would sleep tonight as Eleanor Blackhorse, legally bound to a man she barely knew. As she blew out the lamp and laid down fully clothed atop the quilt, too tired to undress properly, Eleanor found herself wondering what her father would think of the choice she had made. "You told me to trust him, Father," she whispered into the darkness. "I hope you were right." With that prayer hanging in the air, she surrendered to exhaustion, slipping into a dreamless sleep. Dawn broke with the sound of urgent knocking. Eleanor was instantly awake, her hand reaching for the revolver before her eyes had fully opened. Thomas's voice came urgently through the door. "Eleanor, we need to leave. Now." She opened the door to find him fully dressed and armed, his expression tense. "What's happened?" she asked, already reaching for her saddlebags. "Pierce's men," Thomas replied grimly. 6 riders approached town from the west 20 minutes ago. The stable boy recognized one from Thornwood. Eleanor felt her heart sink. "How did they find us so quickly?" Thomas's jaw tightened. Someone in Benson Creek must have sent word. "We need to move before they organize a search." They slipped out through the boarding house's back entrance, where Thomas had already prepared their horses. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the horizon in delicate shades of pink and gold. "We can't go to Cheyenne now," Eleanor realized as they mounted quickly. "They'll be watching the main roads." Thomas nodded, guiding his horse toward a narrow trail that led away from town. "There's another way, through Cherokee territory to the south. It will take longer, but few white men would dare follow us there." Eleanor hesitated only briefly. "Lead on, Mr. Blackhorse," she said, adjusting her hat determinedly. "It seems I'm about to meet my new in-laws." Their escape from Benson Creek was tense but uneventful. Thomas led them through back trails and dry creek beds, constantly alert for signs of pursuit. By mid-morning, they had put significant distance between themselves and the town, entering a landscape of rugged beauty. Rolling hills covered in sage and scrub pine, with dramatic red rock formations rising in the distance. Eleanor found herself studying Thomas as he rode slightly ahead of her, noting the natural way he read the land, how his posture shifted subtly to accommodate the changing terrain. She had known many skilled horsemen in her life, but there was something different in the way Thomas moved. Not just skill, but a profound connection to the landscape itself, as if he and the horse and the earth were engaged in a silent conversation. "We'll rest here briefly," Thomas announced as they reached a sheltered hollow with a small spring bubbling up among the rocks. As they dismounted, Eleanor noticed him wince slightly, his hand going to his side. "You're injured," she said, more statement than question. Thomas shook his head dismissively. "It's nothing. An old wound that troubles me sometimes when I ride too long." But as he reached up to unsaddle his horse, Eleanor caught sight of a dark stain spreading on his shirt. "That's not an old wound," she said sharply, moving closer. "You're bleeding." Thomas sighed, relenting under her scrutiny. One of Pierce's men recognized me last night. We had a disagreement before I returned to the boarding house. And you didn't think to mention this? Eleanor demanded, anger masking her concern. Thomas met her gaze steadily. There wasn't time, and it would have changed nothing. The wound is minor. Eleanor set her jaw stubbornly. Let me see it. My father taught me something about field medicine during the war. When Thomas hesitated, she added more softly, Please, you've risked enough on my behalf already. After a moment's consideration, Thomas nodded, carefully removing his jacket and lifting his shirt to reveal a shallow knife wound along his ribs. It wasn't life-threatening, but it needed attention. Eleanor retrieved a small medical kit from her saddlebags, another of her father's practical lessons, and set about cleaning and bandaging the injury. Her touch professional, but gentle. "Why didn't you fight back?" she asked as she worked, noting the controlled way Thomas endured her ministrations. "A man like you could have easily overpowered a drunk from Thornwood." Thomas was silent for a moment, his dark eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Violence against a white man, even in self-defense, would have complicated our situation," he finally said. "I chose to accept this small injury rather than risk greater consequences." The simple pragmatism of his answer struck Eleanor forcefully. This was the reality for a man like Thomas. Every action calculated against potential repercussions that a white man would never have to consider. As she finished securing the bandage, her fingers lingered briefly against his skin, warm and alive beneath her touch. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning it for far more than just his explanation. They continued their journey through increasingly wild country, eventually making camp in a protected canyon as the sun began to set. Thomas built a small, nearly smokeless fire while Eleanor prepared a simple meal from their provisions. They ate in companionable silence, the strangeness of their situation gradually giving way to a tentative comfort in each other's presence. "Tomorrow we will reach Cherokee land," Thomas said as they finished their meal. "My mother's sister lives there with her family. They will shelter us while we decide our next move." Eleanor nodded, suddenly apprehensive about meeting his family. "Will they accept me?" she asked hesitantly. Thomas considered the question seriously. "They will honor our marriage, even understanding its unusual nature. My aunt is a wise woman. She will see the purpose behind our arrangement." Later, as Eleanor prepared her bedroll on one side of the fire, she found herself watching Thomas as he checked their perimeter one final time. In the flickering light, his profile was strong and dignified, the planes of his face highlighted by shadows. "Thomas," she called softly, making a sudden decision. "I've been thinking about what happens after, when we've secured the land and gone our separate ways." He turned toward her, waiting silently for her to continue. "I want you to know that I would welcome your counsel even after our arrangement ends. My father clearly valued your friendship, and she hesitated, searching for the right words. "I find that I do as well." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight easing of the constant vigilance he maintained. "Your father spoke often of your strength," he said quietly. "But he failed to mention your capacity for kindness." He moved closer, sitting across the fire from her. Few white women would show such grace in these circumstances. Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire between them. "Perhaps few have had the opportunity to know a man like you," she replied honestly. The words hung in the night air, neither of them quite prepared to explore their implications. After a moment, Thomas simply nodded once, accepting her statement without comment. "Rest now," he said, his deep voice gentle in the darkness. "I'll take first watch." As promised, they reached Cherokee territory the following day. The landscape gradually changed, becoming more wooded with small clearings where modest cabins and farmsteads could be seen. Eleanor noticed the subtle ways Thomas's demeanor shifted as they rode deeper into this territory. A relaxing of his shoulders, a new openness in his expression. When they crested a hill overlooking a small valley with a cluster of well-maintained buildings, Thomas reined in his horse. "My aunt's home," he explained, gesturing toward the largest structure, a cabin built in a style that blended Cherokee traditions with settler influences. Smoke rose from the chimney, and children played in the yard under the watchful eye of a woman grinding corn nearby. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. Children called out excitedly, running to alert the adults. A tall, dignified woman emerged from the main cabin, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. Thomas dismounted and approached her with respect, speaking briefly in Cherokee before switching to English. "Aunt Willow, may I present Eleanor Blackhorse, my wife?" The older woman's eyebrows rose slightly at this introduction, her keen eyes taking in Eleanor's travel-worn appearance and obvious nervousness. "Welcome to our home," she said in accented but clear English, her expression giving away nothing of her thoughts. Any wife of Thomas is family here. The next few days passed in a blur of new experiences for Eleanor. Thomas's extended family accepted their presence without prying, offering food, shelter, and quiet companionship. Eleanor found herself drawn to Aunt Willow, whose calm wisdom reminded her of her own mother. On their third evening, as they sat shelling beans together while Thomas helped the men repair a damaged roof, Willow finally broached the subject that had clearly been on her mind. "My nephew tells me your marriage is one of necessity, not love," she said without judgment. Eleanor's hands stilled momentarily. "Yes," she admitted. "It was arranged to protect my property from a dishonest man." Willow nodded thoughtfully. "Many marriages begin for practical reasons. My own was arranged by our families." She continued her work, her weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. But a seed planted for necessity can still grow into something of beauty, if given proper care. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the implication. "Our arrangement has a defined end," she said carefully. "Once my land is secured legally, we will part ways." Willow's dark eyes, so similar to Thomas's, studied her thoughtfully. "Is that truly what you wish? I have seen how you look at my nephew when you think no one notices." Before Eleanor could respond to this uncomfortably accurate observation, shouts from the edge of the settlement interrupted their conversation. A young Cherokee man rode in at a gallop, calling out urgently. Thomas and the other men hurried to meet him, listening intently to his report. Eleanor joined them in time to hear the news. Pierce had gathered a large party of men and was searching the territory systematically, claiming to be hunting a kidnapper and thief. Some carried official-looking papers, presumably warrants issued by a sympathetic judge in Thornwood. Thomas's expression darkened as he translated for Eleanor. "They're using the law against us, just as I feared," he said grimly. "They've managed to delay the recording of our marriage certificate in Benson Creek, which gives them a window to claim you're still legally unattached." "What can we do?" Eleanor asked, fear and frustration evident in her voice. "We can't hide here forever, and I won't put your family at risk." Thomas was silent for a long moment, considering their limited options. "We must reach Cheyenne directly," he finally decided. "Once our marriage is recorded with the Territorial Land Office, Pierce's warrants become meaningless." He turned to his aunt, speaking rapidly in Cherokee. She nodded, replying in kind. "Willow says there's a trader leaving for Cheyenne at first light," Thomas explained. "He's married to a Cherokee woman and can be trusted. He'll take us in his wagon, hidden among his goods." That night, as they prepared for their journey, Eleanor found Thomas standing alone outside, staring at the stars. She joined him silently, drawing her shawl around her shoulders against the night chill. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "I never intended to bring such trouble to your people." Thomas glanced at her, his expression softening in the moonlight. "My people are well acquainted with trouble," he said without bitterness, "and they understand the importance of standing together against injustice." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "As do I." Eleanor felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, admiration, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand, her pale fingers intertwining with his darker ones. "Whatever happens in Cheyenne," she said with sudden conviction, "I want you to know that I will honor the promises I made, both to you and before the judge." Thomas looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "As will I," he replied, his deep voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, the pretense of their arrangement seemed to fall away, leaving only a man and a woman standing together beneath a vast sky of stars, their futures as intertwined as their fingers. Then a call from the cabin broke the spell, and they separated, each turning toward the practical demands of their impending journey. But something had shifted between them, a seed planted, as Willow had said, that might yet grow into something neither had anticipated. The journey to Cheyenne was tense but uneventful. Hidden beneath canvas and trade goods in the back of the trader's wagon, Thomas and Eleanor endured the jolting, cramped conditions in silence, speaking only when necessary. They passed through 2 checkpoints where Pierce's men were questioning travelers, but the trader, a gruff man named Hollister with a Cherokee wife, played his role perfectly, presenting himself as a simple businessman with nothing to hide. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the distinctive skyline of Cheyenne came into view, a growing city of considerable importance as both a railroad hub and the territorial capital. Hollister delivered them to a modest boarding house run by a widow sympathetic to Native causes, who agreed to provide lodging without asking uncomfortable questions. "The land office opens at 9 tomorrow morning," Thomas said, as they shared a simple meal in Eleanor's room, both too wary to venture into public spaces. "I've arranged for a lawyer to meet us there, a man who has worked with Cherokee land claims before." Eleanor nodded, pushing her food around her plate without much appetite. The strain of the past week was evident in the shadows beneath her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. "And if Pierce has men watching the office?" she asked. Thomas's expression remained steady. "Then we face them directly. We have the law on our side now, a legitimate marriage and clear title to your land. Pierce's influence may be strong in Thornwood, but here in the territorial capital, his reach is limited." Eleanor set down her fork, meeting his gaze directly. "There's something I need to ask you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "When this is over, when my land is secure and we go our separate ways, what will you do?" The question seemed to catch Thomas off guard. He was silent for a long moment, considering. "I will return to my people," he finally said. "Use what I've learned about white man's law to help protect our remaining lands." He paused, then added, "And you? Will you return to running the ranch alone?" Eleanor hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead. focusing instead on the immediate challenges. "I suppose I must," she said slowly, "though I admit the prospect seems lonelier now than it did before." The admission hung between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge its implications. Thomas rose from his chair, moving to the window to check the street below, a habit born of necessary caution. "We should rest," he said, his back still turned to her. "Tomorrow will test us both." As he moved toward the door that connected their rooms, Eleanor called his name, stopping him. "Thomas, thank you. Not just for the protection, but for—" she struggled to find the right words. "For treating me as an equal. For seeing me as more than just a means to an end." He turned back to face her, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "You are a remarkable woman, Eleanor Blackhorse," he said quietly. "Any man would be fortunate to call you wife in truth, not just in name." Before she could respond to this unexpected tribute, he had slipped through the door, leaving her alone with thoughts and feelings too complex to untangle. Eleanor moved to her small mirror, studying her reflection. The woman who looked back at her was changed from the one who had stood defiantly in the Thornwood courthouse just days ago. The same determination remained in her eyes, but there was something else now, a deeper understanding of both the world and herself. "Eleanor Blackhorse," she whispered, testing the name on her lips. For the first time, it felt less like a legal fiction and more like a possible future, one she hadn't allowed herself to imagine until this moment. Morning brought clear skies and a sense of purpose. Eleanor dressed carefully in her best traveling suit, while Thomas wore the respectable attire of a rancher, rather than his more distinctive buckskins. They met their lawyer as planned, a shrewd, spectacled man named Everett, who specialized in complicated land cases. He reviewed their documentation with professional efficiency. "The marriage certificate from Judge Morris is in order," he confirmed. "And the land deed clearly shows your father's intent to leave the property to you, Mrs. Blackhorse. With these documents filed together at the land office, your husband becomes the legal owner of record. But we can simultaneously file a covenant ensuring your continued rights to the property, regardless of the marriage's future status." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Thomas, who nodded slightly. This arrangement had been his suggestion, a way to protect her interests even after their inevitable separation. It demonstrated a level of consideration and foresight that continued to impress her. "Let's proceed then," she said with determination. "The sooner this is settled, the sooner we can return home." As they approached the Territorial Land Office, an imposing stone building flying the Wyoming territorial flag, Eleanor's steps faltered briefly. Standing on the steps, engaged in conversation with a uniformed official, was Jonathan Pierce himself, immaculately dressed and looking entirely in his element. "Keep walking," Thomas murmured, placing a supportive hand at the small of her back. "Show no fear or hesitation." Everett moved slightly ahead, creating a buffer between them and Pierce as they climbed the steps. But it was too late. Pierce had spotted them, his eyes widening in recognition before narrowing with calculated rage. "Ah, Miss Blackwood," he called loudly, abandoning his previous conversation. "How fortunate to find you here. I've been quite concerned for your safety since your abduction." He emphasized the word deliberately, glancing meaningfully at the official beside him. "These gentlemen have been most helpful in my search for you." Eleanor straightened her spine, drawing strength from Thomas's steady presence beside her. "It's Mrs. Blackhorse now, Mr. Pierce," she corrected him clearly. "And as you can see, I am perfectly safe and here of my own free will." She gestured to Everett. "Our lawyer has all the necessary documentation to record our marriage and confirm my husband's legal interest in what was previously my property. Your concerns, while noted, are entirely unnecessary." Pierce's pleasant facade slipped momentarily, revealing the fury beneath. The territorial official beside him looked confused, glancing between Pierce and the newly arrived party with uncertainty. "This is absurd," Pierce sputtered, regaining his composure. "This woman was promised to me by judicial decree. This arrangement is clearly coerced and invalid." Everett stepped forward smoothly, his manner professional and unflappable. "I assure you, sir, the marriage performed by Judge Morris of Benson Creek is entirely legitimate under territorial law. If you wish to contest it, you are welcome to do so through proper legal channels. In the meantime, we have business with the land office." He turned to the official. "I believe you're Deputy Commissioner Taylor? We have an appointment to file these documents immediately." The official, Taylor, straightened, recognizing the authority in Everett's tone. "Yes, of course. Please, come inside." Pierce moved to block their path, his controlled exterior cracking further. "This isn't over," he hissed, directing his venom primarily at Thomas. "No judge will recognize a marriage between a respectable white woman and a savage. You'll regret the day you interfered in my business." Thomas met Pierce's gaze steadily, neither backing down nor escalating the confrontation. "The only regrettable day," he said quietly, "was when you decided that your greed was more important than Miss Blackwood's freedom to choose her own path." Eleanor, standing between the two men, made a decision that surprised even herself. With deliberate calm, she reached out and took Thomas's hand in full view of Pierce and everyone on the steps of the land office. "My husband and I have business inside, Mr. Pierce," she said clearly. "I suggest you step aside." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty perhaps, or the quiet dignity, seemed to finally penetrate Pierce's anger. He stared at their joined hands, then at Eleanor's resolute expression, and for the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Without another word, he stepped aside, his posture stiff with contained fury. As they passed him and entered the building, Eleanor kept her hand firmly in Thomas's, drawing strength from the connection, even as she wondered at her own boldness. The process of filing their documents was mercifully straightforward. Taylor, perhaps sensing the importance of the matter, expedited the necessary paperwork himself, rather than delegating to a clerk. By noon, it was done. The marriage officially recorded, the land legally transferred to Thomas Blackhorse, with Eleanor's protected interest clearly documented. As they emerged from the land office, Pierce was nowhere to be seen, having apparently decided to retreat and reconsider his strategy. "It's finished," Everett confirmed, handing Thomas the certified copies of their documents. "Mr. Pierce may still attempt to contest the arrangement, but his legal avenues are now severely limited. I would recommend returning to your property as soon as possible to establish your presence there." They parted ways with Everett outside the land office, thanking him for his assistance. As they walked back toward their boarding house, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of relief and uncertainty. The immediate danger had passed, but the question of what came next loomed large between them. "We should leave for Thornwood tomorrow," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "Pierce will likely return there to regroup. The sooner we reclaim your home, the better." Eleanor nodded in agreement, but found herself reluctant to focus on practical matters just yet. The success of their plan should have brought closure, yet instead, she felt as if something important remained unresolved. Back in the privacy of their rooms, as they packed their few belongings for the journey home, Eleanor finally found the courage to voice the question that had been growing in her mind since their conversation the previous night. "Thomas," she began hesitantly, "now that the legal matters are settled, have you given any more thought to what happens after?" He paused in his packing, regarding her with those deep, thoughtful eyes that had become so familiar in such a short time. "That depends," he said carefully, "on what you want to happen." Eleanor felt her heart quicken at the implication behind his words. They had entered into this arrangement as a matter of necessity, but somewhere along the way, something had changed between them. A seed planted, as Willow had said, that had begun to take root. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, choosing her words with care, "about what your aunt said, about marriages that begin for practical reasons but grow into something more." She moved closer to him, summoning all her courage. "I wonder if perhaps we might give ourselves time to discover if there could be more between us than just this arrangement." Thomas's expression remained guarded, but something flickered in his eyes. Hope, perhaps, or uncertainty. "The world would not make it easy," he said quietly. "A Cherokee man and a white woman. Many would oppose such a union, even here in the territories." Eleanor smiled slightly. "The world has already tried to dictate my future once. I find I have little patience for its judgments now." She hesitantly reached for his hand, much as she had outside the land office. "I'm not proposing love, Thomas. I barely know what that means between a man and a woman. But I do know that I respect you, and I believe you respect me. Perhaps that's enough of a foundation to build upon, if you're willing." Thomas looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And if in time we find that we're not suited," he asked, his voice low, "then we part as friends, with gratitude for what we've shared," Eleanor answered honestly. "The legal protections are already in place. I would lose nothing but the chance to discover what might have been." Thomas was silent for a long moment, considering. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, their first real gesture of affection. "I find," he said quietly, "that I too am curious about what might be possible between us." The simple admission sent warmth spreading through Eleanor's chest, a feeling of possibility she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. Their return journey to Thornwood was markedly different from their flight. They traveled openly, no longer fugitives, but a legally married couple with the full protection of territorial law. When they finally crested the rise overlooking Eleanor's ranch, their ranch now, the sight of the familiar buildings brought tears to her eyes. Pierce's men were gone, the property reclaimed by its rightful owners. As they rode down toward the house, side by side in the golden light of late afternoon, Eleanor felt a sense of homecoming deeper than she had anticipated. This land represented not just her father's legacy now, but the beginning of her own story, one she was choosing to write on her own terms. Thomas reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, surveying the property with appreciation. "Your father built something fine here," he observed. "Land worth fighting for." Eleanor nodded, seeing her home through new eyes, not just as a sanctuary to be defended, but as a place where a future might unfold. "Our first task should be to repair that broken fence in the north pasture," she said pragmatically, falling easily into the rhythm of ranch management. and we'll need to see about replacing the cattle Pierce's men drove off." Thomas turned to her, a rare smile transforming his features. "Is that an order, Mrs. Blackhorse?" he asked, a hint of humor warming his voice. Eleanor returned his smile, feeling a lightness she had thought lost forever. "Consider it a suggestion between partners, Mr. Blackhorse," she replied. "I believe we agreed to build something together, did we not?" As they dismounted in the yard of what was now their shared home, Eleanor reflected on the strange path that had brought her here. From the courthouse where she had been promised to a gentleman she despised, to freely choosing a Cherokee man with scars on his chest and honor in his heart. There were challenges ahead, certainly, but for the first time since her father's death, the future held promise rather than threat. As Thomas offered his hand to help her down from her horse, Eleanor took it willingly, stepping not just onto familiar ground, but into a new beginning of her own making. The court had promised her to a gentleman, but Eleanor Blackwood, now Blackhorse, had found the courage to point to the Cherokee with scars on his chest and choose her own destiny. As the sun set behind the Bighorn Mountains, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and pink, she and Thomas stood together on the porch of their home, the land stretching before them like a promise. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it as they had faced Pierce and his schemes, together, with determination and growing trust. And perhaps, in time, with something even stronger binding them than the legal documents filed in Cheyenne. For now, it was enough to stand side by side, watching the stars emerge over land that was rightfully theirs, free to discover what might grow from seeds planted in necessity but nurtured by choice. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.